Hello, welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are on the planet. Thanks everybody for joining, and for those of you who are still joining, we have a pretty exciting webinar ahead of us today. We titled it "Optimizing Cloud and Observability Cost in the Gen AI Era," and we're super excited to have as a special guest with us today the CEO and co-founder of FinOut, Roy Ravhon. How's it going, Roy?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Excellent, excellent. Thanks for being on. Very much appreciated. And also with us, of course, Paul Treby from somewhere in or around Minnesota, our vice president of sales. How's it going, Paul?
It's going great. Thanks for pulling this together, Jill.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for being here too. And we're very excited. This is our first webinar from our brand new offices. The last webinar we were on, we kind of announced, it was last week, we announced that we were packing everything up and moving to new offices soon. And this is the location of the new offices. So we're all very, very excited of this move. And you can see this is not a fake background. This is actually the background of our offices. So we're kind of showing off a little bit, but that will be the end of it, I promise. So thanks everybody for being here again. Like I said, we're going to talk today about the difficulties of balancing cost and observability and just managing cloud storage and everything that I think most of you who are online today will be familiar with. But hopefully we can also not only talk about the problems, but also offer some actionable insights and actions that you can take with you back to the office to try to optimize and reduce your costs, because it's as we all know and probably agree on, it's getting tougher and tougher to manage. And we have two very, very highly experienced experts on this panel today. I'm going to let Paul start with just a very brief background about ground cover, and then Roy will talk about FinOut in a high level, just because we have audiences from that know both of our or each of our companies maybe separately, and we want to give the opportunity for everybody to get to know each other. Don't forget, we have a Q&A box open, so feel free to ask your questions throughout the webinar, and we'll try to to address those questions as we go along the webinar. There's also a chat for anybody who wants to say hi and where they're from, so feel free to do that as well. So with that, let me hand it over to Paul, and you can now start presenting
Perfect.
ground cover just in very briefly, and then we move on to FinOut. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, perfect. I'll try and keep this brief, and certainly if there's questions, you can ask deeper questions in the follow-up, or we can connect offline. But I think there's a couple things that make ground cover completely unique to the rest of the observability industry. And the first is kind of what I like to call our easy button. Our eBPF sensor is a game changer. Not only is it lightweight, super easy to deploy, like literally just you deploy it as part of your infrastructure, and you get logs, metrics, traces, deeper traces than you're used to seeing. And it does an amazing job of connecting the infrastructure to the workloads or the code that's actually executing on your stack. So you can solve problems that you haven't been able to solve before, including full payload of traces with zero effort. And that'll be one of the things we talk about, the cost of doing tracing when you kind of move away from the big three commercial vendors and go down an open source stack. We'll definitely be talking about that today, because it's something that the industry is very much involved in and very much exploring. But then the other cool thing about ground cover that makes us unique is we're not a normal SaaS provider in the way that you think of like your ever-growing bill with your commercial observability vendor. We actually run our backend in your infrastructure. The security teams love it because it provides full data privacy. It allows you to determine how long you want to retain your data. And it kind of solves the problem of cost versus coverage, right? Because you're actually just paying for the actual compute costs versus marked up prices for cloud storage and cloud compute. It allows us to decouple from the typical volume-based pricing, volume of logs, metric cardinality, volume of traces, which is impossible to predict of what it's going to look like over the course of a year, and which leads to the painful experience that many companies have, especially as they're developing a modern stack, as they start looking to adopt generative AI technologies. Typically involves Kubernetes in some way, shape, or form. The cost can spiral out of control astronomically. We do have a TCO calculator on our website, but this is a common example that we see over and over again. This is a real customer case study here. where they were migrating from an EC2 infrastructure to a Kubernetes infrastructure. They were using Datadog for 3 years. We ended up saving them 90%, over 90% off of their bill for the current year. But the reality was that they were looking at the growth of their stack and the migration to Kubernetes-based infrastructure, the amount of volume increase that they were seeing already just in their test environments for logs, metrics, and traces. It really wasn't about the 91% cost savings. It was about a 15 to 20x growth over the next 3 years, which was completely unsustainable. And we'll definitely double click on this type of the data that comes behind this and why this is so prominent in the industry. Because I think almost every customer we're talking to is seeing this sort of challenge as they figure out how they monitor this and keep ahead of the game and avoid customer issues.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Paul. And we are definitely going to go deeper into all of these topics. But if we're already on the topic of managing costs and reducing costs, hand it over to you, Roy, so that you can present just what FinOut does a little bit.
Sure. So getting into the trend of things cost a lot of money in the cloud, so observability is one huge aspect. Obviously, the cloud providers are a very big one as well. And once we get into the state of spending a lot of money on the cloud, we need to start to measure our ROI. We need to start to change our relationship with cloud cost and eventually start to implement FinOps. And when companies look at typical FinOps journey, it's going through a lot, right? So it's starting with the realization that cloud is a lot more expensive than what we anticipated it to be, and going for like multiple different maturity levels. And implementing FinOps is not a tool you can just buy. It's an organizational decision. It's like implementing DevOps. Just buying ground cover won't going to change anything, right? You need to work with that. You need to start to implement the processes on top of it. So same with FinOps. And what FinOut helps companies to create is that system of record to build and manage FinOps from the ground up. So we take cost data from everything that you're paying for on a usage-based basis, so AWS, GCP, Azure, Oracle, but also the other solutions that cost a lot of money, like Paul just mentioned, so Datadog and Databricks and Confluent and Snowflake, and OpenAI is coming soon, which is a great topic for today's webinar. Native Kubernetes support. So we take everything into one platform, showcase the entire cost, and then help companies with the cost allocation challenges, show back, charge back, financial planning and governance, budgeting cycles, forecasting cycles, democratizing FinOps, and letting engineers change the way that they interact with cost information and putting the right information in the right time to the right person who's in charge of everything.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Roy. And I got to say, if you're going to trust anybody to help you with your return on investment, you got to trust somebody whose name is literally ROI, right?
That's got us our seed round.
What's that?
That's got us our seed round.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you both for these presentations. They were short and sweet. And with that, I think we can start to dig a little deeper into our topics. And we'll start with just I think the top question, the number one question is, why is it so challenging for organizations today to optimize the cloud spend, their observability spend, and to reduce these costs? Maybe we start with whoever wants to start, actually, but if not, I'll just choose.
Sure.
I choose you, Paul. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, it's really interesting whether I'm talking with a 100-person startup or a Fortune 500 company. At some point, the observability cost is a pain point. I recently met with a crypto company. The guy was running operations. He said their observability costs had exceeded 5% of their overall operational costs, and it was a CFO mandate to get it under control. And I think the fundamental problem in the industry is that every observability provider charges on volume of data, size of compute nodes per user, or some combination of those, making it like impossible to predict what your actual spend is going to be over the life of the contract. This leads to kind of like scaling back of monitoring. There's this constant cost versus coverage dilemma. And then, people are inclined to switch. Their Datadog bill goes from $1 million to $7 million, right? And they start looking at open source tooling because it's quote unquote free, right? But then that leads to maybe they start with their lower environments, and now they've got training issues, they've got adoption issues, they got different workflows, they got a whole host of people that have to patch, maintain, update that, roll that out. And, it doesn't really end up saving them anything in the long run. Having been in the observability market as long as I have, which is over 20 years, I think there's been one ROI that's remained true. The cost of solving problems earlier in the development lifecycle is much higher than it is solving it in production, right? So there's a sound argument could be made that you need your best tooling available in test, staging, and production, right? Which is why I think the observability market's ready for a disruptive approach, because the big players are all basically charging in the same way. And it's frustrating organizations, and they feel like there's no way out. So they move to open source, which there's some benefits and some trade-offs, which we'll talk about later on as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I also was in the observability space before FinOut, so it's a problem close to my heart as well. What we see with many organizations that they always look for the magic solutions and magic bullets, right? So Datadog is too expensive. Let's just cut something out, or going from one extreme to another, right? So from Datadog to managing everything on their own Elasticsearch, it's too far of a difference. So we see it both on observability and on cloud and on data warehouses, and for anything that costs a lot of money for that matter. So what we advise customers to do when they first engage with us, even is not to buy FinOut at some point. If you're not ready, you need to understand what are your goals, what are you actually trying to achieve, what's the business justification for everything that you're doing. Maybe your engineering time and the project that you're gonna invest in saving $1 million for cloud optimization, does it really worth it? Maybe it's not, you're not ready to make the transition. Maybe you're not measuring the right things. So everything is about changing the relationship that we have with our vendors, understanding what's the business objectives, try to measure the proper ROI, and then we can start to take the proper decisions going forward. And that's true for the entire stack, in my opinion.
Yeah, so you guys touched on a few topics already that we are going to go in even deeper in the next few questions. But just to connect this to the larger scope of this, the topic of this webinar, we talked about Gen AI, right? We're in the Gen AI era. It's kind of becoming maybe an overused buzzword, but the essence of it is, there's basically an explosion of data, and you need more data storage. You need more resources to run all those applications, and so that also ends up, of course, costing a lot more money. So how is that directly or indirectly influencing costs from what you're seeing? Maybe we start with you on this one, Roy.
Yeah. So if you talk to enterprise CIOs about Gen AI, usually the two biggest concerns is Gen AI privacy and Gen AI cost. So that's always a huge question, and I'm still personally not sure what's going to be the next operating model for Gen AI. It's going to be if we're going to acquire LLMs from third-party solutions like OpenAI and Anthropic, or we're going to getting married once more with AWS on that, and using Bedrock or even self-hosted kind of model. But the one thing we know for sure is that it's going to drive up cost and cloud consumption, regardless of where it's utilized. And going back to measuring ROI, we start to see many enterprises adopting Gen AI because the CIO told them to adopt Gen AI, and then we start to see all right, is this a real feature or just AI washing for what we're doing? And now that you start to have the picture of how much does it actually cost to put that Gen AI buzzword on your website, is it worth it, or is it something that is very sustainable for the business, and what's the trade-off? So we adopted Gen AI, we spend a couple of more $1 million on those kinds of technologies. Where did we save? What did it replace? Did it change headcount? Did it change other types of infrastructure? Who should we charge it? What's the budget for Gen AI? It's not just something I can buy and hope for the best. Someone needs to pay for that. Where in the P&L does it belong? So it starts to open lots of very interesting questions that we see many larger organizations starts facing right now. And I'm personally fascinated to see where's the market headed in the next couple of years. It's moving so quickly that it's almost impossible to track right now.
Yeah, 100%. And I think on the observability end of this, so you obviously you produce more data, you have more monitoring you have to do. Paul, anything to add on that from the monitoring aspect?
Yeah, there's a few things come to mind, and maybe one or two that you haven't thought about before. Of course, there's a cost to observability solutions, right? Every log, metric, and trace you send to somebody else's cloud, they've got actual compute and storage costs, so they mark that up, and that's why it's so expensive. But the other thing too, I think, is that when you're using kind of a legacy vendor for a modern stack, there's a cost to running those agents at scale in production that actually drives your actual compute costs up substantially, which I think this is why eBPF is so intriguing, why there's so much buzz about it in the marketplace right now. Not only connecting, this simple deployment, but connecting your infrastructure costs to your workloads so you can, proactively reduce them. Cross availability zone communications seems to be like something that's resonating with every customer I talk to. It's like, do we actually need to talk cross availability zone, or is it just a misconfiguration? And it ends up driving a very, very high cost per node over time if you don't kind of think of these things. The other thing too, I think is interesting, is that a lot of these organizations that I've been talking to recently have some component of their AI stack that they want to remain offline, right? If you think about it, the IP, the language models that they're generating, that's their crown jewels of their company. If they're really focused on it and they're really doing something other than AI washing, which, by the way, I will borrow that term and use that in future conversations. But they don't want that portion connected to the internet, so that kind of leaves them with open source tooling, which is you can't really use Datadog in an offline environment. Dynatrace used to have something like that, but they moved their Grail platform to SaaS only. New Relic doesn't work offline, so you're basically stuck with like a self-managed Grafana stack, using Prometheus, OTel. And it really becomes challenging to not have modern observability, especially because you probably don't have the skill sets if you're using a commercial vendor for the rest of your stack. It creates this interesting observability problem. And then, the other thing I think that's been interesting too, kind of going back to that single customer slide we showed before, is that with the amount of data and compute and cost growing, they may have been okay paying, high 6 or 7-figure bills for their observability stack. But when they start seeing this infrastructure is going to 15 or 20x their cost, they're really looking for something else. They're looking for an alternative, and they're looking at the market, not seeing a lot of good options out there. And that's something we'll double click on further as we go through this conversation. But this offline piece, I think, is going to be something that is going to be more and more relevant. People don't want to put their IP at risk, and they don't have a lot of good options as far as managing the performance of that platform, but also managing the costs of it.
Right. So let's zoom out a little bit and talk about just the market in general. And oligopoly is not a word you hear a lot on webinars or pretty much anywhere, I guess. But just to be clear, monopolies are basically markets where you got one company that pretty much controls the entire market. Oligopolies are ones where we have a very few number of companies that control the market. Do you think it's fair? And I'm not sure it's 100% true, but I would like to hear your take on this. In the cloud storage and the observability markets, do you feel that it's fair to say that we have markets that are controlled by a few companies? And I think there's some interesting things that have been happening in both markets in terms of acquisitions. What are your takes on that? And maybe we start on this one with you, Paul, as you mentioned already a few of those companies in your previous answers and things that they have been doing. So what's your take on this?
Yeah, it's interesting how everybody I talk to is like, you can ask like 2-3 questions and you kind of know exactly what their pains are because they're only using a handful of tools, right? And ultimately the cool disruptive companies get acquired, the talent leaves, the innovation stalls, and then we're kind of stuck with the same big players over and over again. I was running the central region at New Relic. That was the first time I had ever heard of eBPF when they acquired Pixie. And that product is really kind of stuck in time, right? And the main reason why is because it didn't really fit in with their legacy enterprise sales motion, right? Their agents drive a ton of ingest. They sold services along with it. And the per user pricing that they had over the last 5 years is what kind of allowed them to grow their revenues, right? But it's not something that the customers were super happy about. And then, of course, we're seeing Splunk and Isovalent being acquired by Cisco, which ultimately is going to lead to the same challenges, right? The best people are going to leave. They're going to, bundle stuff in, but then, as you re-rack your contract and you actually start adopting and using it, your bills are going to grow astronomically, and then you're stuck again. So yeah, it really is, at least on the observability side, it's kind of a vicious cycle of the big players are around because they do have good technology, but they also kind of stifle the market. So you don't have a lot of options out there, which is why so many people are exploring open source, which is not without its own challenges.
For sure. Yeah, Roy, I think you have the same kind of thing happening in your market too, right?
Yeah, so pretty similar, but as the observability still had a couple of at least aspire to be younger player. In the cost management, they all gave up, so it's now IBM and Broadcom, and so it's either that or going with the young startups. You don't have anything in the middle, so this gives us one of the biggest market opportunities that we have on our hands right now, but. 100%. I think that both markets are born with the cloud adoption, and then there are a couple of years of just momentum going with those vendors keep on running, and then came kind of a halting stop. So Splunk was once the most innovative companies on the planet, right? And then now, who uses Splunk, right? And it keeps on happening in both spaces. And I think the cloud kind of evolution is forcing the incubation of new companies because cloud technologies keep on creating. Who knew that eBPF would be a thing 2 years ago? Right? It's so they keep on producing new technologies. Kubernetes changed the entire picture. AWS changed the entire picture. Now with more and more solutions, GenAI is going to do it again probably. So there are more and more opportunities to innovate and for younger companies to start and take a significant market share. I don't think anyone's going directly to acquisition. I think there's a couple of big companies that can be built both in the cost management space and the observability space.
So thank you, and we have already a question from Michael in the Q&A. Again, everybody is welcome to use the Q&A box. You can also ask questions anonymously if you prefer. But Michael here is asking if we could expand a little bit on the eBPF buzz and how exactly it helps with the cost, observability, or any other angles of the operation stack. I think Michael meant the observability stack. But maybe ops in terms of DevOps. Anyways, I not to turn this into a full on presentation about ground cover. Paul, maybe you can give a few words about eBPF and how that impacts cost, and I think that maybe we can just very briefly touch on in cloud, which is something that's unique to ground cover, and how that affects cost a little bit.
Yeah, no, it's a good way to frame it. I think eBPF alone doesn't solve it, but it does provide an interesting trade-off. So I think kind of the state of the market right now is, a large percentage of companies are using Datadog, New Relic, Dynatrace. They're the biggest players in the market. They're the most well-known names. And right at some point, their bill becomes unsustainable. So then they want to pivot to, Prometheus, OpenTelemetry, Grafana, right? But what many organizations find is that open source stack is not easy. It's not free, right? It's free like a puppy in the sense that it doesn't cost anything for the software, but the hosting costs, the implementation costs are much bigger than they expect, especially as they try to fully displace maybe a commercial vendor they've been using for a number of years. And then the OTel piece, I think, is also really interesting. It's a vision we believe in. I think every large player supports OTel, but this is probably the biggest piece where eBPF comes in, right? So OTel ends up becoming a development pipeline. It's a journey that you have to start and go on, and it takes you time. All right, there is some auto instrumentation in OTel, but there's always some component of your stack that has to be maintained, or else it ends up being a black box that you have no visibility into. And I think this is why, what I like to call our cheat code for tracing with the eBPF sensor is a game changer. It means you can move away from Datadog, Dynatrace, New Relic today, have tracing as well as logs and metrics available just by installing the eBPF sensor as part of your infrastructure, and you get deeper visibility than you're used to, connecting the infrastructure and the code and the workloads, the APIs, and figuring out where your costs are going out of control. However, and by the way, going back to OTel, that provides you some breathing room, right? Because you don't just like turn off your data lake agents, turn on an OTel agent, and it's just done. As I mentioned, it takes some effort, it takes some thought, and maybe you go full OTel, maybe you use our eBPF sensor and you just do some OTel. Either way, it provides you some breathing room and allows you to solve problems while you make that journey. But then the other piece of it is that if you just had an eBPF agent, let's say Datadog came out with the exact same eBPF sensor that we have today, right? It's going to generate more data. It's going to generate more cost, which is why the second piece of it, the in-cloud architecture that's decoupled from volume-based pricing, is a game changer. What I didn't dive into on the architecture slide is that we're using what we think are state-of-the-art open source technologies that are much more efficient than what you probably would use on your own. Much less compute power, much less storage cost. We're compressing data in excess of 90%. So like whatever's in your mind as far as like how expensive it would be to run our stack, it's much, much smaller than it would be if you just built like out a Grafana stack and an Elastic stack in your backend. So that in-cloud piece of being able to control your own retention, not have to make the cost versus coverage trade-off, combined with the easy button that the eBPF sensor provides, the package together is what allows you to kind of do this at a predictable, fair cost. So if your infrastructure grows, your costs are going to grow like this. It's never going to be this hockey stick of like, I moved to Kubernetes and microservices and containers, and all of a sudden my bill goes up 10x. You'd never have that with ground cover. So I think that's a piece that's important to think about. But then at the same time, you've got this cutting edge open source backend. So if you are committed to moving to open source, it's a viable path to get there, right? You can do a lot of cool stuff with OTel. It's going to take you some time. It's the breathing room, and then that cutting edge open source backend that's managed as a SaaS-like product kind of gives you the best of both worlds.
Amazing. Thank you very much for that clarification, Paul. And so just moving on to a bit of a different topic, maybe more in your area, Roy. How does FinOut empower development teams because, at the end of the day, you can have the best software in the world. If you don't get the user buy-in, basically, if they don't understand that this is a top priority for their organization, it's going to be very difficult for them to understand how to use it or even want to use it. So how do you empower with your software, with your solution? How do you empower development teams to actually care about cost, and how do you help them understand what they can do to optimize their spending and make them take that action?
So I think the FinOps market is going through like what the DevOps market were like experiencing a couple of years ago. So if we were talking 6-7 years, and we were hesitating on the concept that developers would actually care about their code like after they've written it, and go into observability system, track their usage, and like actually wake up at night if their code is not working. We will probably get a couple of laughs, right? So same thing is starting to happen with FinOps right now. The fact that we're measuring and we're expecting developers to take cost into the same set of considerations that they have, and the same as they're logging into ground cover after each deployment to make sure that everything is okay and their metrics are good and the SLA was not broken, and so they're starting to do the same with FinOps. So they look at that the cost of the service remain intact, and that it's something that just the merged set of expectations from them is different. So with FinOut, we helping developers to get the data that they need. So if you look, you're a Fortune 500 company, you have hundreds of development teams and tons of cost across like multiple different cloud providers. If you log into your cost management solution and you see just everything, you're probably going to get overwhelmed. Like, what's yours? What's your responsibility? What's your team? So using FinOut, we can help narrow it down to make sure that you only get the sets of information that is relevant to you. You only get the cost optimization, solutions that are really just what you're responsible for, and you have the ability to take action for. And by doing that, fostering that kind of culture to allow the FinOps practitioner to work together with the engineer, to work together with finance, to work together with procurement, to make sure that this entire loop is closed. We help make that kind of encouragement, and we often see like tens to thousands of developers logging into FinOut every week just to get the cost of the service, and it really becomes something that is part of their day-to-day lives.
Amazing. And just to stay on that topic, we'll stay with you, Roy. Do you have, because it's always nice to bring it down to earth and talk about specific examples. I'm sure you have case studies. I believe I saw a couple on your website. Is there any nice stories that you can talk about of success that a company had using FinOut and how they changed the way they do things that you can talk about?
There are many. Fortunately, like the very good examples are something I can't share, but we have one Fortune 500 that changed their entire budget cycle working on FinOut. It's something they always struggled with is getting the engineering director to give a proper estimation of what their cloud cost is going to be, and finance wanted to see it like rolled up all the way to the enterprise. And in order to see like what's the cost of we can help try and budget. We can say like, okay, we're not going to pay AWS more than $100 million this year. Great, but like if it's not going to get like the proper breakdown on instructions, it's just not going to work. And if we're going to cross the $100 million, what are we going to do? We're going to close the service? No, right? So it's important to start to manage that kind of sets of expectations and budget and rebudget like constantly and get like the proper sets of information from the people who are actually like part of the service. So using FinOut, now every engineering director can present their specific budget for the next period, the budget period that they have. Then it can start to roll up all the way to finance, and the engineering director can track like how their team is going on like on track and budget versus actual for everything, and make sure that they're communicative, they're going to get over, and where finance starts to have that kind of trade-offs. So one team is went over, one team went under. I can start to balancing out and like take some kind of actionable decision to make sure that we're gonna eventually reach the target margin that we have in our exponential reporting.
Amazing. Thanks, Ryan. And again, like I said, you have some of those on your website. I think anybody who wants to read on and get some specific details on case studies, I think can definitely go on your website and check them out. And Paul, on your end, are there any stories that you can share?
Yeah, well, I think the theme of Roy's last comments were about you need to have a plan, right? A process in place. And it's interesting to me how so many companies that are building their new stack alongside their existing stack, they're like, you know what? I know that the approach I have right now is not going to work for the new stack, but I'll just build an observability once we're done building the stack. And it's amazing to me because to the point of setting $100 million budget for your AWS bill, it's impossible to not trend the wrong way if you're not observing what you're building as you're building it or as you're migrating it. So my advice would be to, do some research as to like what, Kubernetes native or cloud native stack you want to use in the end, and start it as you're building it. Just like I said before about the theme that's been true about the ROI is always higher when you can solve problems in the development lifecycle earlier on, right? Versus the cost of a production outage. It's the same thing too. We see this all the time. We install in a customer's environment and they tell us that they found a problem with their architecture that they didn't know had existed for the last year, right? So start with building observability figure out what your end game is going to be. If you want to try ground cover, of course, we have a free tier. It's free for life. You can have up to 3 users. You can use it on any size cluster. But whether you use ground cover or use something else, I think you have to have a plan in place as to observability and best practices and connecting the infrastructure to the application to see where things are going wrong, and have a path to understand the configuration side of these complex modern cloud architectures. You build out your next gen AI platform, or even you just modernize your stack. There's something that's always going to be true about Kubernetes. It's always going to be complex, right? So as you start getting to a Kubernetes stack, or you start moving to multi-cloud, multi-region, costs can spiral out of control. Don't wait till the end. Get started with it from day one, and you'll end up saving money throughout that entire process. I guarantee it.
Cool. So we have a question from the audience again, from Gonzalo, who's asking, based on your experience working with different organizations, is there a healthy percentage of operational costs that should be allocated to observability I'm going to ask you, Roy. I think I've heard the number 30% of cloud cost goes to observability somewhere. I think that's I'm not sure if that's
30? 30?
yeah, that's what I believe. That's what if I'm not wrong, that's what I've seen in a couple of quoted in a couple. It's pretty big. It's basically the number one cost. But I'm sure you have some better insights on to what a healthy percentage should be.
I think Paul is a bit more qualified to answer that, but I think 30 is a bit a bit
Seems
excessive.
high. That makes sense. I mean, I could be wrong. Paul, do you have any insights on what a healthy percentage should be?
Well, I think it's a complex question too, because there's often the bigger the company, the bigger the platform, the bigger the team is that is supporting observability. So like when I mentioned that crypto company, they said that it was 5% of their overall operational costs, and that was including salaries, compute, license costs, and their CFO deemed that too high. Now I know the crypto industry typically has a massive amount of compute. They're definitely multi-cloud, multi-region, and their compute costs are much higher than you would think for their revenue. It's a company by company answer. I don't have a generic answer on that, unfortunately, Gonzalo.
Okay, that's fair enough. There's a repeated question about eBPF that I think people want to hear specifically from you, Roy, if you have any insights on how that comes into play in a optimization space, cost optimization space.
So there were a couple of use cases for eBPF in cost management, especially to map down relationship between different pods and between everything. I think there's one company, I don't remember their name, that are doing something around that area. It's mostly like a niche use case. Like if you want to get really, really, really deep into the relationship between each pods and like who affected what, and you want to get very deep into cost allocation without with like very high precision. So eBPF is something great. Usually for most customers, it's mostly a more nuanced approach is okay. So I can take like a metric from ground cover and like estimate my data transfer costs or like the relationship between two services and break down shared cost based on kind of metric, instead of having the actual like eBPF based communication for everything that is happening. It's usually we don't get to those granularities because like getting a metric and doing it per eBPF can be a very little kind of skew between the two, and the that level of involvement within the environment is just too hefty. But maybe in the future.
Perfect. So again, thanks everybody for their questions. There have been some very interesting questions. If there are any more, we're getting to the end of this and we're getting ready to wrap up. So if there are any questions, that's the time to ask them. But as we get people to think this over just a little bit, Roy, is there anything else that you want to add? And if not, just tell us how people can find out more about FinOut.
No, I had a great time spending the last 40 minutes with you guys. If you want to learn more, finout.io. We have lots of information on the website. You can schedule a demo and read a bunch of case studies and learn more about us.
Amazing. Paul, anything from you, or just let people know how to reach you, how to learn more about GroundCover?
Yeah, certainly. You can find me on LinkedIn. You could send me an email to paul@groundcover.com. If you're curious about the technology, we've got a kind of a no frills approach. There's the free trial, which I mentioned is free for life on any size cluster. And then if you don't have permission to install in a cluster in your work environment, we've got a playground as well. You can go to play.groundcover.com, kind of go through a live demo environment, see the eBPF traces, see OTel traces, see Prometheus metrics that we automatically import, and get an understanding of what it might look like in your environment.
Excellent. Great. So no more questions from the audience. Thanks everybody for being online. Everybody who joined. Thank you, Roy, for being part of this. Thanks again, Paul, as well. And I hope to see you guys on the next one. Take care, guys.
Thanks for hosting, Jill.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Take care.
Thank you.